So we're going to start with a short look at Singaporean identity, right? What it even means to be Singaporean or from Singapore or living here, because all of those things mean slightly different things. And to help us think about those issues, it's a very dear friend, Dr. Vernie Oliveiro, who's currently working with our Ministry of National Development, so deeply involved in policy issues, but also a historian by training, and with her PhD from Harvard. So she's always, I think, brought multiple influences into the work that she does, and I'm looking forward very much to what she will share with us about Singaporean identity. So, Vernie, please.
Spirit of the speakers in this conference, I think I might start with a lame joke. I was going to say that our panel actually unites East and West because I grew up in Clementi and Aaron grew up in Bedok. I thought rather than actually give you 2 or 3 points, I would respond to some of the issues that other speakers in the conference have brought up, and to leave you, I think, with 2 questions about the forward-looking nature of Singaporean identity. So I saw this piece of public art recently on the Singapore River, and it struck me that, in the first place, there's these statues, this installation is meant to portray the uniting of East and West in the building of Singapore's port along the Singapore River. What struck me as a student of the humanities is that there is a certain dynamic going on in this picture. The only person talking and saying anything at all is the white guy. And maybe that actually says something about the nature of colonialism, right? Which is that Asian populations listen as white people, or in this case, the British colonial tells them what to do. On the other hand, however, there is a certain sort of weapons of the weak for the academics in the room, a weapons of the weak kind of resistance in the posture and the facial expressions of the Asian people involved. The other thing, of course, is that the only person sitting is the white person. And that was pointed out to me by an artist friend of mine, that there is something contested and fragile here and ambiguous about colonial domination in the making of Singapore's early history. As a Eurasian person, that conflict between East and West has always been something very central to my identity. And I looked into our archives for some early references to the Eurasian community in Singapore. And I found this reference made from a book written in 1865 about the Eurasian family. And it said, some of the children were as dark as Hindus, others as fair as Swedes, but there was this difference made and admitted to be correct on all sides. The fair ones went out to evening parties, while the dark ones stayed at home. The fair ones were expected to take a leading part and so were attentively educated, and the dark ones were intended for more humble usage and so had little spirit in them. Such were the arrangements that a happy Eurasian family fell into without involving dispute or disagreement. And what was curious to me is that this European traveler in the Far East did not see the inherent tensions in this happy arrangement. And actually, ironically, going further down in this essay, he actually points out several points of tension, right? So he points out that the Eurasian father is actually unhappy about the multiracial nature of his heritage and bemoans his own father's mistakes in producing him from a union with a native woman. The author of this piece actually then goes on to say that European whiteness is fragile in the tropics, that it is impossible to transmit the qualities of Anglo-Saxon nature in the enervating climate of the tropics. It's curious to me that this sort of racial hierarchy, of colonialized racial hierarchy, can continue to exist in what is nevertheless a family, right? And the fact is that this coexistence of conflict and cohesion continues to coexist not only in this Eurasian family, but actually in many Eurasian families down the line. If you look at the literature of the Eurasian community, there is this constant angst over whether we belong with European society, and then in the 50s and 60s, whether we belong in Singapore, and even as recently as 2016, 2015, you have Joseph Schooling having to speak Malay in order to prove that he belongs, right? I thought I would take the story then further forward into the future and refer to the Goh Keng Swee report of 1978, which some of you might remember. The Goh Keng Swee report of 1978 basically looked into the future, what we want in Singapore citizens. And the major curriculum change out of this report in 78 was the introduction of religious knowledge tests in Singapore. So if you were a student in Singapore, you had to do Buddhism, Christianity, Islam as your community might ascribe, right? What was interesting to me was this, again, duality between East and West, with Lee Kuan Yew's message to the community, pointing out, on the one hand, Confucianist ethics, Malay traditions, and Hindu ethos over Western methods of scientific inquiry. And similarly, the Goh Keng Swee report itself pointing to secular education in a foreign tongue and traditional values of one's own people. As an historian, this is very, very significant to me because it's a very common trope in the anti-colonial nationalisms of men of their time. Prasenjit Duara talks about the heavy authenticity, the heavy weight that is given to cultural and traditional authenticity, right? So if 100 years ago, the context of East versus West connection in Singapore is colonialism with its deeply racialized hierarchies. In the middle of the 20th century, what we have is the meeting between East and West influenced by the experience of anti-colonial nationalism. The 1990s sees a very different dynamic. By the 1990s, what we have is two issues. One is greater concerns among communalist ethos in Singaporean society, hence the desire to create 5 shared values, a national ideology that would unite all of Singaporeans. But even then, note the last value, which is respect for the individual, right? Community support and respect for the individual. That last value was actually added after extensive consultations with Singaporeans and was a nod to the individualist ethos that they then ascribed to Western culture. What's also curious about that time was the rise of Asian values discourse, which Ambassador Bilahari pointed out before, as a reaction against Western triumphalism. That is true. But it was also, I think, a reaction to a spirit of the age in the 1990s, when people all across the world, fed up with the Cold War, were beginning to look to cultural definitions, cultural explanations for movements in international history. So you have, for example, Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, right? In my own school at Harvard, there was an increasing shift towards culture in international history. And the identification here of Asian values was part of that spirit. And as globalization proceeded apace, you then saw all this language about stayers versus quitters, heartlanders versus cosmopolitans, first world home, world-class home, first world economy, and then remaking Singapore, right? And the context here again is globalization and what it means to Singaporean identity. I wanted to conclude my brief remarks by pointing out, by asking what happens today. And I think Singaporean identity today, or at least in the 2010s, exists in a very different context, right? I think we are much more confident. I think the ambassador was correct that Singaporean is often defined negatively. But I would also argue that there is a distinction between elite and vernacular discourses of Singaporean identity. This is the difference between, on the one hand, the Speak Mandarin campaign, and on the other hand, the Teochew Hokkien and Cantonese you find in our streets. It is a difference between official efforts to promote Confucianism in the 1990s and the much more colorful and syncretic celebrations of Taoism and Buddhism that you find on the streets again. And similarly with English, you find on the one hand official celebrations and promotions of speaking English well, and on the other hand, the flowering of Singlish in our literature. Here I have 2 books recently published, one by Joshua Ip and the other by Anne Ang, which very richly use Singlish and combine Singlish, which is an English language inflected with local grammar and vocabulary, in Western art forms, right? So the sonnet on the one hand and short fiction prose on the other. And the thing is, while some of the elites might run away from this and saying that and say that normal Singaporeans might be unable to translate between the two languages, Singlish and English, as an historian, I would argue or point out that one of the achievements of English, at least in the early modern period, was the writing of Paradise Lost by John Milton, which is an achievement, if at all, because for the first time in history, you have the use of the vernacular language English in epic poetry, which is previously only written in Latin. So the idea that you have vernacular language flourishing in literature is, I think, an act of tremendous confidence in the future. So I'd like to leave you, again, I guess, with two questions, right? The first is, can we transcend the question of cultural authenticity when we think about Singaporeanness and simply ask what makes sense for us, right? I think that the obsessions with Asianness was very much the result of a colonial and then an anti-colonial past. And that surely moving forward, there needs to be a question about whether or not something makes sense, not because it is Asian, but because it simply makes sense. And the second is, will we become more confident in our vernaculars and stop translating or sanitizing ourselves for the world? And I think precisely this confidence about Singaporeanness is occurring in a time where you have a more multipolar world, where there is a recognition that the standards by which we judge ourselves are themselves vernaculars, and which there is much, and in which there is a greater grappling with the power relations that have hitherto defined us. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Vernie. Thank you for that.